The rain falls like a punishment over Seoul, hammering against the panoramic windows of a penthouse clinic that doesn't officially exist. Inside this nameless facility in the back hills of Gangnam, Dr. Jasmine Cole finds herself caught in a triangle of silent power and extreme pressure. To her left is Madame Sunhee, a woman with the stillness of a compressed spring, leaning in so close that her presence feels like a physical weight. In the background, Kang Jae-Hyun, the silent king, watches from a luxury chair, his sharp features and unreadable intensity projecting a relaxed but dangerous authority. He is a man who looks like he has never lost anything, yet his life is currently a shallow, labored rhythm fighting against a traitor's bullet. Madame Sunhee leans in further, her voice a cold, strategic whisper that cuts through the scent of antiseptic and roses. She isn't asking for help. She is deciding the future. She looks Jasmine in the eye and delivers the ultimatum that reorganizes the world. "Save my son," she whispers, "and I will make him marry you." Jasmine's eyes widen as she processes the weight of those words, her stethoscope a heavy reminder of the professional world she is about to leave behind. She is a world-class surgeon who believes her skill is her only true inheritance, yet she has suddenly been treated as a piece of currency in a Mafia transaction. Trapped between her Hippocratic oath and a future she didn't choose, Jasmine stares back, shocked and pressured, but ultimately the only one in the room with the hands steady enough to keep the silent king from flatlining. The black sedan wound through the back hills of Gangnam like a silent predator, climbing a private road that felt more like a scar against the lush, rain-slicked landscape. Dr. Jasmine Cole sat in the rear, her fingers tracing the worn leather of her surgical bag, watching the city lights of Seoul blur behind a curtain of punishing rain. The driver had not spoken a single word since the pickup, his eyes fixed on the road with a discipline that bordered on the mechanical. Jasmine exhaled a slow, shaky breath, trying to reconcile her reality as a world-class cardiothoracic surgeon with the armed men now flanking the entrance of a hospital that appeared in no medical directory. When the doors hissed open, Jasmine was struck not by the clinical coldness she expected, but by a haunting, expensive beauty. High ceilings and soft, amber lighting illuminated fresh roses, an aesthetic of crisis that felt both deliberate and disturbing. There were no nurses in scrubs, only men in dark suits who watched her with the predatory stillness of soldiers. She was led down a long, antiseptic-scented corridor to a private suite at the very end of the hall. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from luxury to pure, concentrated power. Madame Sunhee Park sat by the window, her silhouette small but vibrating with the potential energy of a compressed spring. She wore a pale gray hanbok, her hair pulled into a low, perfect bun that mirrored her ironclad composure. Sunhee didn't stand immediately. She simply looked at Jasmine, a slow, clinical assessment that felt like it was stripping away Jasmine's layers until it reached her very soul. "Dr. Cole," Sunhee finally said, or her English precise and unhurried. "Thank you for coming." "I was given very little choice," Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "Your people are very persuasive." Sunhee tilted her head, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "My people are loyal. There is a difference." She gestured toward the glass partition on the far wall. Beyond it, connected to a labyrinth of monitors, lay Kang Jae-Hyun. He was a man of broad shoulders and a strong, sharp jaw, his black hair falling across his forehead as if he were merely sleeping. But the shallow, labored rhythm of his chest told a different story. He was a man who had never lost a fight, yet he was currently losing his life to a bullet that had shattered a fragile, lifelong defect. His doctors refuse to operate, Sun-hee said, her voice dropping to a strategic, cold whisper as she moved closer to Jasmine. They say the risk is too high, that he is already gone. Jasmine stepped toward the glass, her clinical mind automatically cataloging the arrhythmia and the dipping oxygen saturation on the monitors. She could feel the Queen Mother standing just behind her, a shadow of maternal desperation masked by an empire's cold calculation. I can offer you anything, Sun-hee whispered, leaning in so close that her breath fanned Jasmine's ear. Funding, protection, a name on a building, but I know that is not what moves a woman like you. The room went deathly still as the ultimatum was delivered. Save my son, and I will make him marry you. Jasmine turned slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional fury. She was a surgeon, not a transaction. But as she looked from the icy mother to the dying king behind the glass, she knew she wasn't leaving. She would operate, not for the crown, but because the man on the table was a life only she could save. The transition from the luxury suite to the sterile intensity of the operating room felt like a descent into another world. The scent of roses was replaced by the biting sting of antiseptic, and the silence of the penthouse was traded for the rhythmic, electronic chirping of life support. Jasmine scrubbed in with a mechanical precision, her hands moving through the soap and water with the same focus she had maintained since she was a resident in Detroit. Behind the surgical mask, her breathing was the only thing she could fully control. The surgery took 9 hours and 14 minutes. For most of it, and Jasmine existed in a state of hyper-focused flow, where the world narrowed down to the size of a human chest and the silver glint of her instruments. She worked through the tissue damage caused by the bullet, her fingers navigating the fragile, engineered stability of a heart that had been failing since Jae-Hyun's childhood. At the 2-hour mark, when she saw the full extent of the trauma, she stopped for exactly 4 seconds, a silent count to let the shock pass through her before she began the repair. The air in the room grew heavy at hour 7, the steady beep of the monitor suddenly stretched into a single, terrifying, high-pitched flatline. He's flatlining, the anesthesiologist called out, his voice tight with the knowledge of who was lying on the table. Jasmine didn't look up. Clear, she commanded. But the shock moving through Jae-Hyun's body, nothing. The line remained horizontal, a green streak of silence. 1 second, 2, 3. In the absolute stillness of that nameless hospital, Jasmine leaned closer to the man whose life was currently a transaction. She didn't see the Mafia boss or the silent king. She saw a patient who was choosing the dark. You don't get to give up, she whispered, her voice low and fierce beneath her mask, intended only for him. I haven't come this far for you to let go. Fight. At the 7-second mark, the monitor hiccuped. A stuttered, uncertain spike appeared, followed by a beautiful, irregular rhythm that began to beat its way back into existence. The room exhaled in unison, the pressurized tension breaking just enough for Jasmine to continue her work. When she finally closed the last incision at the 9-hour mark, Jasmine stepped back and stripped off her gloves. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer physical and mental toll of holding a soul in place by force of will alone. She had saved him. She had ignored the marriage deal and the power plays, choosing instead to honor the silent plea of a heart she had first touched in a Busan alleyway 7 years ago. As she walked out to meet the Queen Mother, Jasmine knew the clinical battle was over, but the war for her own future had just begun. The heavy silence of the recovery suite was broken only by the rhythmic, electronic pulse of the heart monitor. Kang Jae-Hyun opened his eyes, and the world rushed in with a cold, tactical clarity. He did not wake with the grogginess of a survivor. He woke with fury already assembled in his bones, a pressurized anger that had been waiting for the first spark of consciousness to ignite. His gaze swept the room, assessing the clinical environment with the instinct of a man for whom every space was either a fortress or a trap. Across the room sat his mother, Madame Sun-hee, her posture as straight and unyielding as a blade. She watched him with the strategic satisfaction of a woman who had just won a war she hadn't asked his permission to fight. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a jagged rasp that tore through the sterile air. "I saved your life, son," she replied, her tone as precise and unhurried as if she were discussing a business merger. Jae-Hyun pulled himself upright against the searing pain in his chest, his jaw set in a hard line. "What arrangements?" he demanded, sensing the shift in the air. When she delivered the information, the promise of a marriage, a transaction made while he was flatlined on a table, the silence that followed was the most dangerous kind. "You promised me like I was property," he whispered, the words vibrating with a lethal, contained intensity. "You promised a woman she could have me like I was a prize." Without taking his eyes off his mother, he pressed the call button. "Find the doctor. Bring her here." Dr. Jasmine Cole entered minutes later, her dark blazer a sharp contrast to the clinical white of the ward. She carried his chart with a professional detachment that seemed to irritate and intrigue him simultaneously. "How much did my mother pay you?" Jae-Hyun asked, cutting through any preamble. Jasmine set the chart down and looked him directly in the eye, then her expression widening not with fear, but with a sharp, exhausted fury of her own. "Nothing," she said firmly. "She offered me your name and your world, and I told her it was an insult." Jae-Hyun stilled, his dark eyes searching hers for a lie he couldn't find. "Then why are you still here?" "Because you are my patient," Jasmine snapped, leaning forward until the distance between the surgeon and the king vanished. "I put your heart back together with my bare hands. I didn't do it for a deal or a diamond. I did it because you were dying." The monitor behind him spiked, a frantic chirping that reflected the sudden, unreadable shift in his expression. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a tool or a threat. He saw the woman who had told him in the dark to fight. The waking king lay back against his pillows, his fury not gone, but redirected toward the realization that his mother might have finally found the one thing he couldn't control, a woman who didn't want him. The fifth morning after the surgery brought a shift in the atmosphere that felt more like a mobilization for war than a medical recovery. Jasmine had intended to hand off the final post-operative charts and return to the safety of her research fellowship, but Madame Sun-hee was not finished with her. Without a private consultation or a moment's warning, the matriarch summoned the senior members of the park organization, the lieutenants and advisors who managed the various arms of the empire, and made an announcement that shattered Jasmine's remaining sense of autonomy. "He is formally engaged," Sun-hee declared to the room of stone-faced men, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had spent 3 decades navigating shadows. "To Dr. Jasmine Cole." Jasmine found out through a news alert on her phone, the headline flashing across her screen like a physical blow. She marched into Sun-hee's private sitting room, her calm so brittle it was the exact opposite of peace. Sun-hee was pouring tea, the steam rising between them in a delicate, mocking veil. "You announced it publicly," Jasmine said, her voice trembling with the effort to remain professional. "I did," Sun-hee replied, not looking up. "Sit down. I don't want tea, but you will sit anyway." Jasmine sat, trapped by that particular gravity Sun-hee possessed, the kind that bypassed rational resistance. and she listened as the older woman explained the cold geometry of the situation. 3 rival factions were currently circling, assessing whether Jae-Hyun's injury was an invitation to strike. They were watching for signs of a crumbling foundation. A powerful alliance with a woman of your standing, a doctor with an immaculate reputation, sends a message of stability, Sun-hee explained, her eyes meeting Jasmine's with a chilling pragmatism. It gives him 30 days. 30 days to heal before anyone dares to make a move. If you refuse, they will strike now, while he is on blood thinners and unable to stand. Every person in this building will be at risk. The weight of the Mafia spotlight felt like a heavy, suffocating cloak. Jasmine wasn't being asked to love him, she was being asked to perform as a political deterrent. When she later entered Jae-Hyun's room, she found him in a state of restrained fury, his monitors chirping in a frantic rhythm that betrayed his calm exterior. He had heard the news, and his reaction was a mirror of her own. "I had no part in that announcement," Jasmine said, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. "I know," Jae-Hyun replied, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. "We are doing this for 30 days, she continued, her voice hardening. 3 public appearances. I will not pretend to feel affection I don't have, and I will not be treated like a prop. Those are my terms." Jae-Hyun watched her for a long moment, the afternoon light catching the sharp angles of his face. He looked at this woman who refused to soften, who held her own name as a shield against his world. "This is fake," he reminded her, though it sounded as much like a warning to himself as it did to her. "Don't get comfortable." "I have my own life to get back to," Jasmine countered, turning to leave. "I don't need your name. I have my own." As she walked away, she could feel his gaze lingering on the empty doorway, the 30-day clock already ticking toward a destination neither of them could foresee. The next 5 days possessed a texture that neither of them could have predicted. They did not suddenly become easy with each other. Ease was not a word that applied to either of them in ordinary circumstances, and the specific pressure of a fake engagement arranged by a determined matriarch was anything but ordinary, yet something shifted in the quality of the friction between them. It became less like 2 opposing forces trying to push the other aside, and more like 2 strong materials being tested to see how they fit together, grinding perhaps, but not breaking. Jasmine checked his charts every morning with the same relentless focus she brought to every patient. Jae-Hyun, in turn, stopped making every checkup adversarial. He began answering her clinical questions without the particular edge he'd had in the first days, and Jasmine found herself no longer anticipating the strike. The mornings became a rhythm she didn't realize she was beginning to value. He watched the way she moved through his spaces, rooms full of his people, environments designed around the logic of his world, and noted that she never once made herself smaller to accommodate them. She was not performatively bold, and she wasn't trying to prove her worth to his lieutenants or his guards. She was simply herself, occupying the space she stood in as if she belonged there, not because she had been placed there, but because she had decided to be present. That quality of quiet, internal authority was rarer than Jae-Hyun had ever cared to admit. On the 4th evening of the arrangement, 3 of his senior advisors arrived to brief him on the maneuvers of the rival factions. They walked in with suits and a sense of controlled urgency, immediately treating Jasmine, who was reading in the corner, as a piece of the furniture. One of the advisors, a man who had been with the organization for 15 years, cast a pointed glance toward her, suggesting without words that the conversation required privacy. Jae-Hyun didn't miss the look. He glanced at the advisor, then at Jasmine, who hadn't even looked up from her book. "Continue," he said firmly, a silent acknowledgement that she was part of the room's relevant occupancy. The corner of Jasmine's mouth moved just slightly, the smallest tell of a private smile. Later, after the advisors had gone, she finally looked up to find him watching her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. She looked back at her book, but the quality of her expression had changed into something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. They were still strangers, and they were still trapped in a fiction, but for the first time, the silent king and the reluctant heroine were looking at each other through the same glass. The shift occurred in the early evening as Jasmine walked toward the car assigned to take her back to her apartment, a vehicle that represented yet another invasion of her independence. She had stopped on the hospital steps to take a call from her research supervisor when two black SUVs pulled up with a synchronized screech of tires. The men who emerged were not interested in conversation. They moved with the lethal intent of those who viewed her only as leverage. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jae-Hyun's men stationed nearby. Jasmine did not run, and she did not scream. As the first attacker lunged, she dropped her phone and swung her heavy medical bag with the focused, efficient energy of someone who had once survived a residency in the toughest neighborhoods of Detroit. The corner of the bag caught the man across the temple, the weight of her equipment providing just enough momentum to buy her 30 critical seconds. Jae-Hyun's security team closed in before the situation could spiral further, and within moments, the four attackers were pinned to the pavement. One of them, a younger man, had a deep laceration on his forehead that was bleeding aggressively, the crimson pooling on the concrete. Jasmine stood there, breathing hard, the adrenaline moving through her in waves. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she noticed a tear in the sleeve of her coat, with the detached cataloging instinct of a trained clinician. Without a word, she knelt beside the bleeding man and opened the very bag she had just used as a weapon. "What are you doing?" one of Jae-Hyun's guards asked, his hand still on his holster. "He's bleeding," Jasmine replied, already pulling out sterile gauze. "Someone get me a light." The guard stared at her in disbelief before clicking on his phone's torch. Jasmine dressed the wound with the same focused competence she brought to the operating theater. The attacker looked up at her, his expression a chaotic blend of confusion and pain. He muttered something in Korean that Jasmine didn't understand, but the guard translated it flatly. "He's asking why you're helping him." Jasmine tied off the bandage and looked the man directly in the eye. "Tell him it's a professional reflex," she said, "but tell him also that if he comes near me again, I will be significantly less inclined to help." From the upper window of the facility, Jae-Hyun had watched the entire scene unfold. He stood with his hand pressed against the cold glass, his heart rate spiking in a way that had nothing to do with his surgery. He had known powerful people and ruthless ones, but he had rarely seen someone so principled under pressure, someone who acted according to who they were, rather than what the situation demanded. That night, when he requested her presence in his suite, the air between them had changed. He wasn't looking at a doctor or a fake fiancé. He was looking at a woman who had swung a bag at an armed man and then knelt in the dirt to save him. "You treated your enemy," Jae-Hyun said quietly as she sat across from him. "I don't have enemies, Mr. Park," Jasmine countered, her gaze unwavering. "I have patients and non-patients. He was briefly a patient." Jae-Hyun leaned back, a small, unreadable shadow of a smile touching his face. For the first time, he realized that while his mother had engineered the match, he was the one who was becoming truly caught. It was past midnight when Jasmine found herself back in the records room, the inability to fully disconnect from a critical patient pulling her back like an invisible thread. She had been methodically working through Jae-Hyun's full medical history, a decades-long record of a life lived in the shadows. Then, She turned a page, and the world reorganized itself around her. The entry was dated 7 years ago in Busan. It described an emergency treatment for a stab wound at a portside clinic, the kind of place where Jasmine had spent 6 weeks during her second-year fellowship training. She remembered that night vividly because it had frightened her enough to make her reconsider medicine entirely. A man had been brought in by 2 armed, desperate companions. He was bleeding out, drifting toward a darkness she wasn't ready to let him enter. The attending physician had disappeared, leaving Jasmine, 27 and terrified, as the only one left to hold his life together. She had stitched the wound with shaking hands, sitting with him in the rain-streaked dark until his breathing evened out. She had never seen his face properly that night, only the glint of his eyes for a single moment before his men ushered her out. Now, staring at the photograph in the file from that same period, she saw the sharp features of a younger Kang Jae-Hyun. Jasmine sat in the small, sterile room for a long time, the weight of the realization pressing against her chest. She had saved him twice, once with borrowed equipment and the raw courage of a student, and a second time with 9 hours of world-class surgery, and Madame Sunhee had known. The Queen Mother hadn't just chosen a surgeon, she had pulled a thread across 7 years, engineering a destiny out of a stranger's quiet act of mercy. Furious and devastated by the sheer scale of the manipulation, Jasmine took the chart and went to find him. She found Jae-Hyun standing by his window, looking out at the city. When she held out the chart, his eyes scanned the Busan entry, and a profound, slow calculation moved across his face. "It was you," he said quietly. "I didn't know," Jasmine replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It was dark and I was just trying to keep someone alive." "I remember the hands," Jae-Hyun said, stepping closer. "I remember someone saying, 'Fight.'" The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of a shared history that neither of them had a name for. Jae-Hyun exhaled, the revelation grounding his mother's interference in a haunting reality. Madame Sunhee hadn't invented the connection, but she had exploited it, turning a moment of pure, unrewarded humanity into a cage for them both. As they stood in the quiet of the ward, the fake engagement felt suddenly, dangerously real. The confrontation began in the pale, early light of the sitting room, a space that usually smelled of expensive tea and quiet control. Jae-Hyun stood before his mother, not with the explosive fury of their first encounter, but with a deliberate, cold clarity that was far more dangerous. He looked at Madame Sunhee for a long time before he spoke. He's watching the woman who had spent years treating the world like a chessboard where he was the most valuable piece. "You chose her before I even knew her name," he said, his voice low and steady. "You found a ghost from 7 years ago and built a cage out of a coincidence." Madame Sunhee did not look away from the window. She sat with her hands folded, the silver brooch on her collar catching the morning sun. "I recognized a pattern," she replied, her tone unhurried. "Whether you call it fate or simply paying attention, I saw what that woman did in Busan. A terrified girl in a room full of armed men who stayed when everyone else ran. I spent 2 years tracking down the doctor who asked for nothing in return." "You should have told me," Jae-Hyun countered, stepping into her line of sight. "You turned a moment of her integrity into a transaction. You used her." Sunhee finally looked up, her expression shifting into the fierce, protective authority of a woman who had raised a king in a world of assassins. "When would have been the right time? When you were unconscious? When you were flatlining? I did not create the thread between you, Jae-Hyun. I simply refuse to let your pride and your distance keep it from becoming what it should be." She stood and walked to him, touching his face with a rare, momentary softness. You haven't trusted your own heart since you were a boy. You protect everything by closing it down. I found the only woman in the world who could save you. Not just with a scalpel, but by being the kind of person who stays. If that is manipulation, then I will accept the title." Jae-Hyun remained silent, the weight of her words settling over him. He was still partly angry, still revolted by the method of her interference, but he also knew the honest, jagged truth. Without her engineering, he would have dismissed Jasmine as just another employee. He would have never looked at her long enough to see the girl from the alleyway. He left the room without yielding, but he left without arguing, finally understanding that his mother hadn't invented their destiny. She had simply forced him to face it. Jae-Hyun found Jasmine in the small garden attached to the facility, sitting on a stone bench in the thin, pale light of the winter sun. She was wrapped in a heavy coat, her hands curled around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She wasn't looking at a chart or a phone. She was simply staring at the bare, dormant branches of a cherry blossom tree, lost in a silence that felt heavy with the weight of everything they had discovered. He sat down beside her, making no effort to maintain the protective layer of authority or the distance of a boss. For the first time, he looked like a man who had simply run out of armor. "I spoke to my mother," he said quietly, the city's distant hum moving around them with complete indifference. "How did it go?" Jasmine asked, looking at him sideways. "She was right about most of it," he admitted, his voice rough with a vulnerability he was no longer performing, "and I will never fully forgive her for the method." Jasmine nodded slowly. "Me neither." The garden was quiet, the air still and biting. Jae-Hyun turned to look at her properly, his dark eyes steady and searching. "I owe you something, Jasmine," he said. "Not as a patient, and not as a debt that can be paid with money or names." He reached into his pocket and brought out a small velvet box. "I have spent 7 years carrying a memory of hands and a voice in the dark. I have spent 7 years not knowing who told me to fight." He opened the box to reveal a ring that was simple and understated, the choice of a man who wanted to say something true rather than something impressive. "This is not my mother's plan," he said, his breath hitching slightly in the cold air. "This is me, sitting in a garden without an organization or an ego, asking a question on my own terms." He looked at her with the same openness she had seen in the eyes of a wounded man in Busan 7 years ago. "I want to know the person who stays when everyone else runs. I want to know you." Jasmine stared at the ring, then back at the man who had survived 9 hours of surgery and 7 seconds of flatline. She thought of her professional integrity, her fear of power imbalances, and the strange thread of destiny that had pulled her to this nameless hospital. "I don't marry mafia bosses," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. Jae-Hyun held his breath, the moment stretching between them like a fragile living thing. "But," she continued slowly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her clinical armor, "I might marry Jae-Hyun." He didn't move immediately, and neither did she. They simply sat in the winter light, finally saying the truest things they knew how to say, while inside the building Madame Sunhee watched from the window and allowed herself a small private smile before returning to work.